Professor Zipes is an internationally renowned scholar in the field of German literature, and he's concentrated much of his work on folklore and fairy tales. And he's been a storyteller in public schools. He's worked with children's theaters internationally as well as locally. In 1997, he founded a storytelling and creative drama program, Neighborhood Bridges, with the Children's Theater Company of Minneapolis. He's written a countless, staggering number of books and studies and anthologies and translations. He's also published extensively on German Jewish literature. And just to mention a few titles, The Operated Jew, Two Tales of Anti-Semitism, the Yale Companion of Jewish Writing and Thought in German Culture, and Unlikely History, the Changing German-Jewish Symbiosis, 1945 to 2000. A scholar of remarkable breadth. His work has been recognized by numerous awards and honors, too many to enumerate here, both locally and internationally. So the title of his lecture this evening is Waking Henry Iliowizi, or How Jews Have Something to Learn from the Dead. Jack, please.
Yep, great. Thank you. And I'd like to thank Temple Israel and Rabbi Zimmerman for inviting me here, and of course Daniel and the Jewish Studies program, which has grown enormously. When I first came here in 1990, where's Jonathan? Where's he hiding there? Okay. Jonathan and I were sort of initiated or tried to initiate a program, and it has really developed in amazing ways, thanks to Leslie Morris and Daniel and many others. So I'm really grateful to be here, even though I'm retired, happily retired, and don't like to be dragged out of my retirement all that much. Now, as people age, they all try to fend off death, one way or the other. For me, personally, at the age of 82, I'm not sure whether I want to fend off anything. Therefore, it's not by chance that I recently made a vow with regard to defining the motto of my work. I want to waken those extraordinary writers of folk and fairy tales who have been undeservedly forgotten before I die. Anything and everything I write is somewhat bound by an oath that I have taken to myself to relentlessly make the past as present in my life, and also in the lives of my friends, by rediscovering unknown, neglected authors. Now, Dan Benemos, a friend and one of the foremost Jewish folklorists still alive and living in America, turned 85 years old this year, and I wanted to contribute an essay to a festschrift honoring him. Fortunately, therefore, I did not have to unbury him. I just had to honor him. And I wanted to find some topic or writer appropriate for the occasion. In particular, I searched for a Jewish writer of folk and fairy tales whom Dan might never have encountered. And this, of course, is a huge task because he is practically omniscient. All right, I said to myself, if that's the case, then at least write about someone like Iliowizi, a remarkable 19th century scholar who, though known has been neglected. And in fact, I did a fair amount of research on Vina before I came across the name of Henry Iliowizi. Should I say Iliowizi, Iliowizi, Iliowizi? And I want to show that he is one of the most unusual Russian Jewish writers of the late 19th century and has been, unfortunately, totally forgotten and neglected, and consequently, I have abandoned Vina for Iliowizi. Here, serendipity played a huge role in my decision to write about Iliowizi, for not only did I discover that he immigrated to Minneapolis in 1880, where I presently live, I'm a New York Jew, but he also moved to Philadelphia in 1888, where Dan Ben Amos has been teaching and living for numerous years. This to me was striking, and it may have something to do with Iliowizi's mystic powers. I'm not too sure, but I'm getting ahead of myself. A few words about Iliowizi's life and works before I discuss some of his fiction that I believe Dan might especially appreciate. And here, before I start, I must say that next to nothing has been written about Iliowizi. None of his books can be found in the University of Minnesota, in the libraries, none, or even in the public libraries. There are no records in the Upper Midwest Jewish archives, even though Iliowizi was a rabbi in Minneapolis for nearly 9 years. So who is this guy? Who is Henry Iliowizi? Born on January 2nd, 1850, in Koynik, near Minsk, where my grandmother, my bubby, had lived, his family was part of a Hasidic community. His parents must have been fairly well-to-do because right after Iliowizi's 13th birthday, they sent him to Romania to avoid serving in the Russian army due to obligatory military conscription. From Romania, he made his way to Frankfurt am Main and then studied at different schools in Berlin, Breslau, London, and Paris, where he began to receive training as a teacher and rabbi in Paris at the Alliance Israélite Universelle. This society, which exists today, had been founded in 1860 to advance the education of Jews living in the Middle East. Its program was dedicated to the emancipation of the Jews from oppressive and discriminating laws and defense of Jews, where they were subjected to persecution. In 1877, the Alliance sent Iliowizi to teach at a school in Tétouan, Morocco, at the home of about 1,000 Jews. However, as Iliowizi describes in his first book, which is titled Through Morocco to Minnesota, Sketches of Life in Three Continents, the conditions of daily life were deplorable. And let me quote from his book. We are near reality in stating that life in Tétouan is, in all essentials, identical with life in Barbary, Turkey, Persia, and Arabia. Nor is there striking similarity wanting between the degree of culture and the moral level reached by Jews of Oriental empires and those of Russia, Romania, Galicia, and elsewhere beyond the civilized lands. Oppression and poverty have their story written on the physiognomy and engrafted on the character of the sufferers. That's end of a quote. Now, due to the depressing and chaotic conditions in Morocco, Iliowizi applied for a transfer and was sent to the United States of 1880, in July of 1880. He briefly worked at a synagogue in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and then moved to, and he didn't know what he was getting into, Minneapolis, where he became the rabbi of the congregation Sharei Tov, Gates of Goodness, now called, as we know, Temple Israel, until 1888. In the only trace of existence in Minneapolis, aside from the marriage certificate with Matilda Flesch, a Bavarian who had come to America in 1871, is a reference in Rabbi Albert Minder's book, The Story of Temple Israel, a personal account. And so I want to just briefly, there's only one paragraph about him in that book. In 1880, the pulpit was occupied by its first rabbi of status and stature, Henry Iliowizi, Romanian, which is wrong, he was Russian, Romanian by birth. He was a man of literary proclivities, a linguist, a dramatist, and a Talmudist. He brought these talents to his rabbinical labors, which he carried on until the year of 1888. On his arrival in America, he became imbued with the spirit of the Reform movement and accelerated the movement to have the congregation become Reformed. So very significant rabbi, hardly any information in this city, even up to now. Apparently, Iliowizi brought about many changes in Sharei Tov until he decided to accept an offer to become rabbi of the congregation Adath Yeshurun in Philadelphia. By this time, however, Iliowizi had no desire whatsoever to become recognized as a talented Reform rabbi. Instead, his ambition was clearly to achieve fame as a writer, a desire that was already evident in Minneapolis. Once again, his merits were quickly recognized by the Philadelphia congregation. I'm quoting from a short piece that they wrote on him in Philadelphia. Mr. Iliowizi is a deep student, a forcible speaker, an interesting and witty conversationalist, considerable of a linguist, possessing a striking memory and a bold and facile pen. Fluent in Russian, Romanian, German, and French, Iliowizi's English was impeccable. And all his known writings are in English, not in any other language. And his writings reflect a strong interest in Jewish identity and history. His very first book was Saul, an epic poem in 1883, and it was followed by Joseph, a dramatic representation in 7 tableaux in 1885, The Quest of Columbus, a memorial poem in 12 books in 1892, Saul, a tragedy in 5 acts, 1894, and the book-length poem Revelation, Worlds, Mystic and Realistic, 1910. It's fascinating. Not one of these books is here in Minneapolis, not one. While interesting, most of these works are somewhat pedantic and florid. In my opinion, Iliowizi's strength as a writer lies in his numerous political articles on the Jewish religion and on his fascination with legends, folk tales, and fantasy. Aside from his notable work, Jewish Dreams and Realities, contrasted with Islamic and Christian claims of 1890, Iliowizi published 2 collections of fairy tales and fantasies. One was In the Pale, Stories and Legends of the Russian Jews, published in 1897, and the other was called Weird Orient, 9 Mystic Tales, published in 1900. And he also published a novel called The Ossuary of Samara, a semi-historic romance of Russian life in 1903. In 1910, after 12 years in Philadelphia, Iliowizi decided to move with his wife to London, where he died the very next year in 1911, relatively young. Now, when I was in London recently, I tried to find out whether I could gain any more information about him. Again, nothing. I went to the British Library, and still, you really have to scrape the barrel somewhere to find information about his life. Dedicated to defending Jewish culture and contributing to an enlightened awareness of the Jewish tradition, Iliowizi has, over the years, become nothing but dust. A sorry fate for a man so talented and desirous of making a contribution to changing the world by shedding light on the life endured by Jews in Russia and Morocco, and not only Jews, and by contributing to the reform movement of Judaism in America. Since it's difficult to learn anything about Iliowizi's sermons and interaction with various synagogues in Morocco and the United States, and since my own interests lean toward literature, I want to discuss the importance of his works of fiction. However, before I describe and analyze the books, I want to emphasize that Iliowizi had two major themes that recur in almost all his writings: the plight of all the Jews living in anti-Semitic countries, in particular Russia, and the necessity to know that we cannot know everything about God and Eden except through a Hasidic mystical faith, and even then, nothing is ever rationally definite and knowable. Iliowizi was a vigorous and insightful writer who, unlike Yiddish authors of his time, wrote in such an erudite and elegant manner that only a tiny group of Jewish readers in English-speaking countries could truly grasp his messages, while his intended readership might have been uneducated Jews in need of enlightenment. His stories, poems, plays, and novel demanded a high level of knowledge and familiarity with Jewish history. The major impediment for the majority of non-literate Jews was clearly anti-Semitism. And Iliowizi made no bones about declaring which countries were the major enemies of civilization that prevented Jews from living in freedom and enlightenment. In his novel, Ossuary of Samara, he wrote, and I'm quoting from his novel, "The fact is that the Russia of today is, as to the spirit of assimilating reforms tried elsewhere, far behind the Russia of Peter the Great. Muscovy is in many respects the China of the civilized world, exclusive, intolerant, inhospitable, cunning, suspicious, despotic, wholly and ludicrously conceited as to her theocratic destiny among the nations." It's almost like it applies to today. In a country where church and state are identical and where adherence to the official creed is held to the safest guarantee for the patriotic loyalty, the logical conclusion must be that all dissenters are both disloyal aliens and heretics, an interpretation applied in grim rigor to the ill-fated Jew, because his cause is nobody's concern. Darkest Russia, however, is not limited to the confines of the Pale. It covers an empire where the sun never sets, peopled by 130 millions of beings who belong soul and body to the white Tsar. Now, there's a great deal of anger in Iliowizi's narrative, but he managed to temper his outrage and channel it through stories that demonstrated the courage, cleverness, and resilience of Jews from every class and gender and in every profession. In the preface to his book of stories, In the Pale, dedicated affectionately to his wife, he wrote, and I'm quoting again, "It's not too hazardous to say that in point of inventiveness, they, the tales, can vie with the Arabian Nights entertainments, and in ideality and moral elevation, they far surpass them. These tales of folklore and fiction may serve to open a window in the great dungeon wherein at least half of the scattered Israel suffers, worships, and dreams." Now, what stands out in the tales of In the Pale is the principle of hope. What Iliowizi gathers and strings together in his tales are Spuren, what the Germans called Spuren, what the great German philosopher of hope, Ernst Bloch, called traces of resilient encounters and experiences that amount to substantial hope for a better life. There are 7 stories in Iliowizi's book, in this book of tales, and they're all optimistic accounts of how Jews in Russia and Northern Africa encountered anti-Semitism and managed to survive. 2 of the more delightful tales are humorous parodies and portray the Russian czars as stupid and easily swayed by prominent European Jews who have huge amounts of money and power, and most of the early narratives are serious moralistic novellas. In my opinion, the most intriguing story is Ezra and Huldah, which begins first in Tangiers, where a stranger puzzles the Jewish community because all he does is walk about with a telegram muttering, "The wind, the wind, the wind." It turns out that this stranger is a wealthy Russian Jew who had escaped from Chernigov near Minsk and is anxiously awaiting his daughter, a young cantor and the messenger of Zion. Now, this story is very involved and complex, and I think I'm going to sum it up instead of reading because it's a little confusing. It turns out there's a flashback, so we have the first chapter, and this Jew is wandering around. His name is Reuben, and nobody knows why he's doing this and saying, "Into the wind, where's the wind, the wind, the wind?" And then we have a flashback. The rest of the novella is a flashback in which we find out that at one point he was very, very powerful and rich in Chernigov, and a Christian lawyer hated him, and eventually goes on to have his son and disappear, a nurse killed. Eventually, Reuben's wife was also killed. And in the meantime, Reuben does have a daughter, and when she turns 19, he wants to have her married off, and then there's a Russian general who's interested in her and wants to rape her, and she kills him. And and so she is sent to jail, and all of a sudden the lawyer, the Christian lawyer who was very anti-Semitic, has a change of heart and decides to defend the daughter, and then sends Reuben off again to Morocco. And that's why he's running. He's expecting somehow his daughter will make her way there, and not only does his daughter make her way there, but it turns out his son was not killed, and so son and daughter return, and also the daughter has found a lover, a cantor who has come from Palestine, and that's the story. Now, this is an amazing story, and as I have written down here, it is, if I can find where I wrote down, it's more of what I would call a soap opera. But it's a soap opera, it's a wonderful soap opera, because it's filled with all types of Jewish stories and incidents, and it's also a story in which this young woman defends herself, which is very strong, and there is this sort of like happy fairy tale ending at the end of the story. Now, that's characteristic. There are many other stories in this first book, but in his second collection, it's called Weird Orient, 9 Mystic Tales. And despite the title, they are actually more traditional than those that are in the Pale. They consist of 9 tales, and Iliowizi explains that the narratives originated while he was living in Tetuan, Morocco, and they were not really his creations. Interested in understanding the folklore of the region while living in North Africa, he organized, this is when he was living there, he organized a group of 19 men who met on a regular basis in the city's casino, gambling casino. And I quote from the book, "Gratuitous music was furnished by an Italian who blew the trombone, by a French teacher who played the violin, by a Hebrew who gave wind to a pipe of reeds, and to 9. And by a Spaniard who harped on the strings. And in the course of a few months, the members of the casino entertained visitors not only from Europe and many quarters of Barbary, but from a more distant Orient, the most of them coming by way of Tangiers, sometimes called the White City of the Dark Continent. The most prominent storyteller was the Parsi Yaqub Malek, an eccentric visionary. However, in the 9 tales, which Iliowizi recalled, adapted, and honed, are not very mystical. Instead, they tend to be moralistic and humorous. For instance, The Doom of Al-Zamari is a bland version of The Wandering Jew, in which a fugitive learns from the wanderer how destructive gold can be. And in King Solomon and Ashmodai, Solomon's greed for gold and power causes him to be duped by the demon Ashmodai, who takes his place as king. There's nothing, actually, of a mystical or weird tale among them all. Now, as an enlightened Reform Jew from a Hasidic tradition, Iliowizi was remarkably open to all religions. What was important for him was to educate people of different religions and creeds so that they would not disparage one another. As soon as he arrived in America, and especially in the Midwest, Iliowizi realized that American Jews, even the new immigrants, were ignorant about their brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, and were also seeking to adapt to the conditions in the New World by abandoning their faith. Though not impoverished like the Jews in Russia, there was an impoverishment of knowledge among American Jews, or to avoid anti-Semitism, many Jews became secular or concealed their Jewish identity. Consequently, it was to this end, to enlighten Jews and the general public, that Iliowizi used his writings, fiction and nonfiction, to redeem the reputation of Judaism, and in his brilliant study, Jewish Dreams and Realities, he was clear about his intention. I want to quote from that book. "Let there be light. Let the Jew study his history and literature. Let him realize his grave history toward his fellow man. The Catholic and Protestant parade the symbols of their faith before the world and send their missionaries to the ends of the earth. But there are Jews, so-called enlightened Jews, who neither know their God nor their history, who represent nothing, live for nothing in this world, and would, were it possible, alter their features to hide their parentage. If we cannot change this class, we should embrace every opportunity to remind them of the filial debt they owe to heroic forefathers and the risk to which they expose their children by allowing them to grow up like weeds, breaking every association with a history of 4,000 years." Now, I think it's very important to recall that Iliowizi was writing during the Dreyfus Affair from 1894 to 1906, and in a period when European Jews were gaining more rights, but also suffering from pogroms and violent anti-Semitic attacks. Jewish identity was stigmatized, and many Jews in America and Europe sought to avoid such stigmatization and gain acceptance by becoming non-Jews or operated Jews. During the course of the 19th century, there had been a steady increase in the number of Jews who became assimilated and gradually abandoned their religious ties to Judaism. Many converted to Christianity to provide their children better opportunities to have careers, while others did so because they did not want to live in fear of the outside world and sought some kind of anonymity. Nevertheless, the majority of the Jews kept their ties to Judaism, either in a religious or a cultural sense. Here, too, the Jewish communities and congregations underwent great transformations that paralleled the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox movements within the Jewish religion. In addition, Zionism began playing an important role in the Jewish publics by the 1890s. For the most part, no matter how a Jew identified himself or herself, no matter what public realm a Jew participated in, he or she was always faced with stigmatization and anti-Semitism. As Dietz Behring has made clear in his significant study, Der Name als Stigma, the name as stigma, Jews were not only subject to physical and legal abuse in the public sphere, but also to linguistic abuse. Jews were discriminated against simply because of their names, or names were forced upon them. Characteristically, the laws regarding Jewish names and rights for Jewish citizens kept changing throughout the 19th century in keeping with a discriminatory attitude that prevented Jews from articulating their views freely in the public sphere. Despite such stigmatization and the rise of racial anti-Semitism toward the end of the 19th century, the Jews placed great hope in rational argumentation and legal reformation to guarantee their rights. The more the Jews became assimilated and took advantage of their rights, the more they clung to notions of social reform, political progress, and the humanitarian ideals of the Enlightenment. Iliowizi was certainly a man of the Enlightenment, a wandering Jew seeking to save Jewish customs and traditions, proud to be a Jew, and proud to assert his Jewishness. He deserves not to be forgotten. And so I want to close with one of his spirited passages from his book, Jewish Dreams and Realities. Here is Iliowizi speaking to you. Thought is the pillar of light by which humanity will be led to salvation. The thinking man is the freest, happiest, and mightiest of mortals. Barbarism, infidelity, irreverence, vice, and sensuality are the absence of noble thought. Thought is the power of powers, the gateway to truth and glory. Thought is an attribute of God Himself, an offspring of eternal wisdom. This is the reason why Jewish philosophy sees in wisdom the supremest emanation from the unsearchable God. The effluence which antedates primordial matter, the fiat which made infinity teem with solar systems. The contemplation of that supreme wisdom flowing from the supremest God is the object of spiritual Judaism, an object not to be attained without perfect freedom of thought. God's wisdom was the dream and reality of the ancient Hebrew. It was the vision and inspiration of the prophetic Israelite, and is the sacred meditation of the modern philosophic Jew. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to do a little
Oh,
Q&A.
okay.
Is that okay?
Okay.
So, hearing you, I see that being a rabbi has not changed all that much, has it? I mean, it's, the idea of wanting to bring Judaism and Jewish culture and traditions to the community,
Yes.
that he was struggling with many of the things that at Reform gatherings, URJ or CCAR gatherings we talk about today. So
Yes.
It's really interesting because we often feel like we always have it harder, but it isn't the case.
Yes.
So, questions, comments, reflections. I want to know, where are these books?
Well, you can. If you go to ABE Books, that's where you can find them. And of course,
There we go.
yes. Pardon? Yes. Yes. You're probably right. If I.
Yeah, you need to.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get back to you. Okay, you're probably right. I think there is some research that should be done here in Minneapolis. I did do research actually in Philadelphia, and I did come across a story that was published in a Philadelphia newspaper. I didn't have time to include it here, but it was about actually not about a Jewish, but an actually Arab boy in Morocco, and how he lost his faith and then comes back to it. But there were also articles he wrote. He was also a prolific writer for newspapers, local newspapers in Philadelphia. So I'm hoping that this talk will be published eventually in this Festschrift for Dan Benemos, my friend, who turns 85 this year. And I'm hoping that it will spur younger people, to do a little more research. And I think that certainly, the Jewish Studies Department should investigate this remarkable, person who I think deserves a lot more attention than he's received. Yeah.
Do we know about any innovations that he originated when he was trying to modernize the earliest rabbinic posts that he had here in Minneapolis?
Right.
How did he contribute to the reform movement?
Right. We don't, and we don't know whether, under what circumstances he left. I think he was quite a very opinionated person. You can see that in his writing. He was a beautiful writer. I mean, I doubt if many Americans could at that time could write as well as he did, both prose and nonfiction. So, in answer to your question, that's again another area of research that has to be done, because I think we have no reason why he uprooted himself and went to Philly, and then from Philly to London, where he died the next year, a young man. So it's just a shame that we don't have enough information on him, I've done my best, but there's more to be done.
Do we know his descendants at all?
Well, I was thinking about that, because he married a German Jew, Matilda, and whether she came over here 8 years before he came, and whether through her family one could possibly do, yeah.
Hiding in people's attics.
Yes.
Somewhere that's been,
Right.
interesting.
Yes.
Hi, Jack.
Hi.
So you suggested that the two books of tales you spoke about this evening, that In the Pale was more literary, and the second one, Gregorian, seemed to draw on more traditional, was actually gathering them in
Yeah.
Toronto. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the style of the collections and whether you see any links to what you know of the folk
Yeah.
traditions.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping when I initially came, I was stunned, when I came across his name and then found out that he was a rabbi here in Minneapolis. Who would have thought, that this were possible at that time? At any rate, his writing, you know, he's just a beautiful writer, but it's just very, very, I won't say academic, very florid, amazingly florid and filled with metaphors. And I don't think he would be a bestseller today because he is, there are some of the stories I think should be reprinted or published somewhere, but I would say that unfortunately I was hoping there was another Kafka here or, a title, Weird Tales. Who's going to, a rabbi publishing Weird Tales, So and that one story that I didn't talk about, maybe perhaps should have, about this Arab boy who runs away from his home because his parents are very strict and he loses his faith. And so that's a very good story. So there may be others that he published outside of the books, and certainly one could, take the two books and the novel. The novel is also fascinating. So he's his worst enemy in that, insofar as he really must have learned his writing, from Victorian writers of the 19th century. The question? Yeah.
A lot of training programs for Scandinavian immigrants and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, other than Rabbi Linda's paragraph, do we know if he was engaged much in some of these community developments, like some of the other congregational leaders?
Yeah. I think he was less of an activist than he was an intellectual. You could tell from those early titles I was talking about. He wrote about 7 to 10 plays, mainly on Jewish topics, and he wrote a lot of essays and so on. So I think that it was like for him, through the pen and through his sermons, that he was active. I may be wrong. I wish I knew a little more about Minnesotan history that's interesting that you bring up that point, because we might be able to find out more about whether because he was somebody who was very open to other religions and mixed with other groups. He certainly probably participated to a certain extent in the changes that were going on, but
It was your comment about his interest in other religions.
yes.
Together that caused me to think that he might likely join with the leaders of
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, again, that's another area that, I or somebody should look into. I hope there's some young people here who are interested in writing about this topic, but it's just so important, I think, for the Jewish history in Minneapolis to know a little more about this guy and the fights he was fighting and then why he left and so on. So he'd be, I think, worth a small biography.
And Charito wasn't here, just.
Pardon me?
Charito was not here in this southern location, so just if there's a visual, and I don't know where the churches are, yeah.
Which is downtown.
Which is down there too, that's a question for me, yeah. So Gary's a former director of downtown churches, so that's just.
Here's something that interests me a lot.
could a little louder? I can.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah, there. Is it-
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. I have that problem too. This sounds very interesting. Weird Orient, 9 mystic tales. Could you say something about that and what the 9 mystic tales are? I'm very curious.
Non-what?
Non-mystic tales.
Oh,
9.
oh,
Nine mystic, not nine.
Weird Orient.
Nine mystic tales.
Yeah.
Weird Orient. Can you say something
yeah.
about that?
Yeah, yeah. Most of those tales are biblical tales that he adapted and recreated. So, to a certain extent, in a pedantic way, because he wanted the tales about Solomon, tales about Eden. In fact, there were 3 tales about Eden. He took these biblical tales and rewrote them in a more contemporary way so that they would have, so that uneducated Jews would learn more about Jewish history. So that's what he did.
Again, it's sort of so interesting to me because sort of my narrative component, maybe I have it, but that back then rabbis, especially Reform rabbis, were kind of interpreting the front of the New York Times for this inward revelation that had deep Jewish understanding and teachings.
Right.
And this is in some ways turning that on its head, that actually the Reform rabbis at that time, or at least Iliowizi, that he needed to talk about Judaism just as much as we do. That,
Right.
that teaching Judaism was such an important part of what he did. So it's, the Reform movement kind of has a different narrative of what was happening during that time. It's interesting.
You mentioned that he wrote several plays.
Yes, yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's any evidence that any of them were staged, or were they just intellectual exercises?
You would have thought that there would be some information about whether they were staged or not. Again, these are very. He writes. He wrote, in fact, at least 7 to 10 plays, and I can't even get a hold of them. So I haven't read them. I've read accounts about them, and there may be, if you go to ABE Books, you might be able to track 1 or 2 down. But I'm not. I don't recall being able to. I tried to collect everything possible about him, but from what I gather, just from the titles of the plays, these would definitely. He wrote long poems. He wrote one book that existed of one religious poem for about 50 to 100 pages. So he was amazingly prolific, and I think that these plays probably would have been very classical, imitative of classical plays. So that's another area where one has to do some research.
Okay, there's 2 more, and then we have reception and food.
This may be redundant, but what languages were these written in initially, and are they available for anyone to read
Yes.
for himself?
Yes. Oh, yeah. He never wrote, as far as I can tell, even though he knew all these other languages and probably wrote letters in other languages, but his English was, as I said in my talk, impeccable.
And he wrote in English.
He wrote
correct?
only in English.
He wrote only in English, and this book places where they're available. So,
Yes.
So Jack will let us know, and we'll get that out, and we'll get what we can
Okay.
here at
Yes.
Temple Israel in our library.
Good. It's good, good.
Right now, right here.
Do we know how he became a rabbi and what the nature of the congregation was?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't. I do know, and I'm forgetting where I got all this information from, but he really studied at some of the best universities in Europe. He studied in Frankfurt, he studied in Breslau, he studied in Paris, and he studied in London. So this man, absorbed, and he left home at 13. And so and again, this is a Jewish kind, who is everything's in his head. And he, I think, traveling alone without his parents, moving from place to place, he became a superb intellectual. His knowledge of English literature and other literature is extremely high. You can tell that from his writing. And how you became, he definitely wasn't a rabbi. Maybe, Daniel, you could explain a little more about that, but maybe the Paris organization anointed him as a rabbi, or could anybody become a rabbi who wanted to become a rabbi? This is a question to you, Daniel.
But probably the Reformed movement was still kind of at its early stage, and they probably didn't have such a formal ordination.
Not that?
He was ordained in a Hasidic yeshiva.
Ah,
His rabbinate was through the Hasidic organization that sent him on a mission, I think, to the U.S. It was only after that
I see.
that he
Yeah,
saw the reform light, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah. Thank you.
But Charlotte was not reformed. He made it that.
Right.
So I don't
That's-
know what year of
Yeah.
his tenure that
Right.
he made it, but Charlotte was Orthodox, from what I understand.
Yes, yes.
And so it was the Levites who made it reform, and we're unsure exactly what year, somewhere between 1880 and 1888.
Right.
Somewhere in there,
Yeah.
he transformed, no?
Yes, you've got,
That was his tenure.
yeah. And what's interesting also, he came from a Hasidic tradition and transformed it into a reform.
Okay, so Marilyn's shaking her head.
Is really the what made Catholicism reform as it is. The Catholicism for many years kind of, as I said earlier, one back and forth between Orthodox and reform, was trying to find itself because of all this. And it really was, Rabbi Gander wasn't real reform. It was like classical reform. And even in the 1930s, I don't know if you're aware.
So we have a tradition of going back and forth, so everybody doesn't like the I am in.
In the 1930s, the officer and Temple Israel considered merging.
No Mount Zion? Was it Mount Zion?
There was an officer and Temple Israel.
See, so everyone who wants to go back to the old Union prayer book will go back and forth. It's our tradition. I like that. I didn't know that. Okay, another moment for me. That's perfect. So it sounds like you have done so much work, and there's so much more to do.
Yes,
So
yes.
we want to partner with you. I mean, this is just
Great.
feels like a reawakening for
Yeah,
us. It's
yeah.
part of our history. It's really important.
Yeah.
So we're looking forward to continuing that work.
Well, I will take a step and I will donate the books I have to listen.
That is
Okay?
so nice.
Okay.
Wow.
And I will.